The attic smelled of dust and forgotten years, a stale, suffocating weight that pressed down on Lily as she dragged the last cardboard box from the shadowed corner, its edges softened by time. Crumbling under her grip like damp earth, the faint mildew creeping into her lungs with every breath. She hadn't climbed these creaking stairs since her mother's death 6 months prior, hadn't wanted to confront the cluttered remnants of a life abruptly ended. But the house was hers now, inherited through a will she hadn't asked for, and the task of sifting through decades of hoarded memories loomed like a sentence she couldn't escape. Her hands, already coated in a fine layer of grime, brushed against something smooth and unnaturally cool buried within the box a single, ornate candle. Its wax, a deep crimson streaked with veins of gold that shimmered faintly, nestled in a fragile shroud of yellowed tissue paper, as though it had been waiting for her, preserved like some relic from a forgotten crypt. She lifted it carefully, the unexpected heft of it pulling at her wrist, and a vague, prickling recognition stirred beneath the fog of exhaustion, dragging her mind back to a winter evening long buried in the haze of childhood, when her grandmother had pressed this very candle into her small, trembling hands. Her voice low and edged with a tremor that hadn't made sense then. "Blow it out only when you're ready for a wish to come true," the old woman had warned, her gnarled fingers tightening briefly around Lily's, her eyes sharp and unblinking, glinting with something that felt less like affection and more like fear. As if she'd handed over a curse disguised as a treasure, and Lily, barely 8, had nodded with the solemnity of a child too young to question the weight of such words. Now, standing alone in the dim attic with the wind howling outside, rattling the eaves like bones against a coffin lid, she turned the candle over in her palms, its intricate carving spirals and jagged lines that seemed to writhe if she stared too long, catching the weak, flickering light from the single bulb overhead, casting shadows that danced across the slanted walls. A hollow laugh escaped her, bitter and dry, scraping her throat as it rose, mocking the absurdity of superstitions that clung to her like cobwebs. Yet she couldn't shake the unease that coiled tighter in her chest. A whisper of doubt that this was no ordinary keepsake, that her grandmother's warning had been more than the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. The kitchen table was a battlefield of chipped mugs and unpaid bills. But Lily cleared a space that night, her movements slow and deliberate, placing the crimson candle in the center as though it demanded reverence, its golden veins glinting under the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed faintly overhead. She didn't know why she'd brought it downstairs from the attic, didn't want to admit that the weight of it in her hands had felt like a dare, a challenge to prove she'd outgrown the strange, heavy warnings of her grandmother, whose voice still echoed faintly in her memory like a wind through hollow reeds. A box of matches sat by the sink, left over from a power outage months ago, and she struck one. The sharp hiss of sulfur cutting through the silence of the empty house, the flame trembling as she held it to the wick, hesitating just long enough for the wax to catch with a reluctant sputter. The light it cast was wrong, too warm, too alive, a pulsing amber glow that seemed to breathe against the walls, and she watched, transfixed, as the flame steadied, its tip swaying like a finger beckoning her closer, though she stayed rooted to her chair, her breath shallow. She laughed again, a brittle sound that broke apart in the stillness, telling herself it was just a candle, just a silly relic from a superstitious past, and she leaned forward, pursing her lips to blow it out. The act a quiet rebellion against the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed in wishes and warnings. The flame snuffed out with a thin wisp of smoke that curled upward, acrid and sharp, and she sat back, satisfied, the house settling into its familiar quiet until she stood to leave and glanced back, her heart lurching as she saw the candle still burning, the wick aglow, though she'd extinguished it moments before. The wax now glistening with a single bead of red that slid down its side like blood from a fresh wound. Panic flickered in her chest, but she forced it down, rationalizing that she must have imagined blowing it out, that exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind, and she reached for it again, this time pinching the flame between her fingers, wincing at the brief sting as darkness swallowed the kitchen once more, leaving her alone with the lingering scent of smoke and something sweeter, something rotten, that she couldn't place. Sleep came reluctantly that night, dragging Lily under like a tide she couldn't fight, her body sinking into the worn mattress as the house creaked and groaned around her, its timbers settling into the cold dark. Though the air felt heavier now, thick with something she couldn't name, but could taste on the back of her tongue, bitter and cloying. She dreamed of her grandmother, the old woman standing in a vast fog-choked field, her gray hair wild and tangled, her face sharper than Lily remembered, etched with lines that seemed to shift like cracks in breaking ice, and she was holding the candle, its flame a furious red that lit her eyes with a manic gleam. You weren't supposed to light it yet. Her grandmother hissed, her voice a frantic whisper that sliced through the dream's muted haze, each word dripping with desperation, her bony hands clutching the candle so tightly that the wax buckled, spilling crimson rivers onto the ground where they hissed and steamed, pooling into shapes that writhed like living things. Lily tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but her throat was locked, her body paralyzed as the field tilted and the fog thickened, pressing against her skin like damp hands. And her grandmother lunged forward, her face inches away, her breath cold and rancid as she repeated the warning, louder now, a scream that clawed its way into Lily's skull. She woke gasping, the sheets twisted around her legs like restraints, her chest heaving as the dream's echo lingered, sharp and real, and she fumbled for the bedside lamp, its weak yellow glow spilling across the room, revealing the candle on her nightstand, though she swore she'd left it in the kitchen its wick dark, but the wax burned down halfway, a jagged line marking its descent. Despite her blowing it out, pinching it out, hours before. Her hands trembled as she stared at it, the carvings along its sides seeming deeper now, more pronounced, curling into patterns that hurt her eyes to follow, and she told herself it was impossible. That candles didn't burn on their own, that she'd misremembered where she'd left it, but the air in the room felt wrong, too still, too watchful, and the faint scent from earlier sweet rot, like flowers, left too long in stagnant water curled around her again, stronger now, seeping from the candle itself. The next day passed in a blur of gray light and restless pacing. Lily avoiding the candle where it sat on the nightstand, its crimson bulk a silent accusation she couldn't bring herself to touch, though her eyes kept drifting back to it, tracing the carvings that seemed to pulse in the corner of her vision, mocking her attempts to pretend the night before had been a trick of exhaustion. By evening, the house felt smaller, its walls leaning inward under the weight of a sky bruised with storm clouds, and she tried to distract herself with a book. The words swimming on the page as the wind outside battered the windows, rattling the glass like something desperate to get in, until she gave up and turned to the candle again. Its wick still dark, but the wax inexplicably lower. A fresh bead of red congealed at its base like a wound that wouldn't heal. She didn't light, it wouldn't light it yet. As she crawled into bed, the room dimming with the flick of the lamp, she saw it flare to life, a single tongue of flame licking the air, casting jagged shadows that stretched across the ceiling. And she scrambled upright, her heart slamming against her ribs, knowing she hadn't touched a match, hadn't even breathed near it. The flame danced, steady and unhurried, and she lunged to blow it out, her breath ragged, watching the smoke twist upward in lazy spirals, only to freeze as the wick reignited moments later, the glow stronger now, bathing the room in a sickly amber light that made the walls look wet, glistening, alive. She pinched it out again, her fingers trembling as the heat bit deeper this time, leaving a blister that throbbed in time with her pulse, and she stumbled back, staring as the wax melted further, pooling on the nightstand in a slow, deliberate spread. The carvings shifting into something uglier faces, maybe, or claws, while that sweet, rotten stench flooded the room, thick enough to choke her, clinging to her skin like damp rot. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, sitting rigid against the headboard as the hours crawled by, the candle burning lower despite her efforts, its light pulsing like a heartbeat, and in the stillness, she heard it, a faint scratching. Not from the wind, not from the house, but from somewhere closer, somewhere inside the walls, growing louder with every flicker of that impossible flame. Morning arrived, cloaked in a dull, ashen light that barely pierced the curtains, leaving the bedroom steeped in gloom as Lily sat hunched on the edge of the bed, her eyes bloodshot and fixed on the candle. Its wax now a grotesque stump, melted down to a third of its original height, the nightstand beneath it scarred with crimson streaks that had hardened into brittle, vein-like tendrils. She hadn't slept, hadn't dared close her eyes after the scratching started, that relentless skittering sound burrowing into her skull, moving from the walls to the floorboards beneath her feet, then fading only to surge back louder, closer, as though something was circling her, testing the edges of her sanity with every pass. The flame still burned, weak but unyielding, flickering in a draft she couldn't feel, and she'd tried everything smothering it with a glass, dousing it with water from a trembling cup, but it reignited each time. The wick sparking back to life with a hiss that sounded too much like laughter, while the air grew denser, saturated with that cloying rot smell, now laced with something sharper, metallic, like blood or rust. She staggered to her feet, her legs numb from hours of stillness, and grabbed the candle, intending to hurl it out the window, but her hands froze mid-motion, the wax searingly cold against her skin, and she felt a jolt, a pulse, as if it were alive, its carving snow unmistakably eyes, wide and staring, boring into her with a malice she couldn't explain. The scratching swelled, no longer confined to the walls or floor, but everywhere behind her, above her, inside her ear sand. She dropped the candle, its flame flaring brighter as it hit the ground, illuminating the room in a violent red glow that revealed shapes in the shadows, tall and thin, swaying like reeds in a windless swamp, their edges blurring as they shifted closer. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the house's oppressive silence, and stumbled backward, tripping over the rug, her gaze locked on the candle as it rolled to a stop, upright, burning lower still, the wax pooling into a perfect circle that gleamed wetly, reflecting not her face but her grandmother's, mouthing words she couldn't hear, frantic and pleading, while the shapes loomed nearer, their presence a weight that crushed the breath from her lungs. The room was a furnace of red light now, the candle's flame roaring despite its dwindled form. A mere nub of wax clinging to the floor as Lily pressed herself against the wall, her palms slick with sweat, her breath shallow and ragged, the air so thick with that rotting, metallic stench that it coated her throat like oil, making every gasp a struggle against drowning. The shapes were no longer vagatol, skeletal figures with limbs too long, too jointed, their faces hollow pits where eyes should have been, swaying in a grotesque dance around the candle's glow. And she could feel them, not just see them, their presence a cold, clawing pressure that raked across her skin, peeling away the last threads of her disbelief as the scratching became a chorus, a deafening rasp that drowned out her own heartbeat. She slid to the floor, her knees buckling, and crawled toward the candle, desperate to snuff it out, to end this, her fingers brushing its icy surface as the flame flared higher, searing her hand with a pain that shot up her arm, and in that instant, she saw her grandmother, again not in reflection, but standing among the figures, her mouth stretched in a silent scream. Her hands reaching out as if to pull Lily back, but the old woman's eyes were gone, replaced by the same hollow voids, her warning too late. The wax melted entirely, pooling into a mirror-flat disc that pulsed once, twice, and then the flame died, plunging the room into a darkness so complete it swallowed sound, light, air itself. And Lily felt it the wish, not hers, never hers granted in the silence as the figures closed in, their bony fingers wrapping around her arms, her legs, her throat, lifting her weightless into the void, while a voice, not her grandmother's, but something older, deeper, whispered through the black, "Mine now," with a satisfaction that curdled her blood. She didn't scream, couldn't scream. As the last shred of her slipped away, the house falling still, the candle gone when dawn broke, leaving only a faint scorch mark on the floor, and an emptiness that lingered, waiting for the next curious hand to find what should have stayed buried. The final wish fulfilled not by the blower, but by the thing that had waited all along, patient and eternal, in the heart of the flame.